Most people believe the worst thing a family can do to you is leave a bruise. They are wrong. Physical harm is a blunt instrument. It heals with time and leaves a scar that serves as a map of survival. But there is another kind of violation, one that doesn't mark the skin but hollows out the spirit. The worst thing a family can do is steal the architecture of your mind. They take the one thing that was truly yours, your thoughts, your labor, the very patterns of your intellect, and they build their own monument upon your foundation. Then, with a chilling kind of audacity, they ask you to thank them for the privilege of being the mortar between their bricks. My brother, Dylan, built a skyscraper of a life on the soil of my mind. He built a high-rise salary, a star reputation, and a life of unearned prestige out of my sleepless nights and the code I wrote while the rest of the world was dreaming. And my parents? They didn't just look the other way. They held the door open for him while he carried my life out in boxes. Welcome to this space. Get comfortable. Perhaps pour yourself a coffee, though I should warn you, by the time I'm finished, you might find it's gone cold. The people in this story had every single chance to choose the right path. They had the maps, the signs, and the warnings. They simply chose to ignore them. If you've ever sat at a table and realized you were the only one not invited to the feast of your own life, I see you. Tell me your story in the comments. We are building a different kind of architecture here. In the Addams family, there were 2 children, but if you walked down the hallway of our Midwestern home, you'd swear there was only one. Dylan's presence was a physical weight. His photos covered every square inch of those walls like a gallery of unearned triumphs. There was Dylan in his graduation cap, tossing it toward a sky that seemed to belong to him by divine right. There was his internship badge, clipped to a shirt my mother had spent an hour pressing to a razor-sharp crease. There was Dylan holding an Employee of the Quarter plaque, his camera-ready grin gleaming under the photographer's lights, radiating a confidence that only comes from knowing you will never be held accountable. And then, there was me. If you looked closely, very closely, tucked near the coat closet where the shadows were deepest and the light rarely reached, you'd find one photo of me. I was in the 9th grade, standing at a science fair. I'd built a neural network classifier from scratch before the world had turned AI into a buzzword. In the photo, I'm holding a first-place ribbon, looking at the lens with an expression of profound apology, as if I didn't quite believe I was allowed to occupy space. Nobody in my family understood that project. Nobody had even asked. Our house sat on a quiet street in the kind of suburb where neighbors measured success by whose child was mentioned in the church bulletin first. My father, Richard, was a retired mechanical engineer who ran our household like a production floor, budgets, timelines, and a rigid hierarchy where he always had the final say. My mother, Diane, kept the garden immaculate, her hands always smelling of lemon soap and potting soil. She loved both her children, but she loved Dylan louder. Dylan was 27, tall, with the kind of handshake that made older men nod in approval. He was a senior developer at Meridian Technologies, a Fortune 500 firm 2 states away. He was engaged to Brooke, a woman who looked like she'd stepped directly out of a lifestyle catalog, all soft knits and expensive neutral tones. My parents called him our star. And then there was me, Angela Addams, 22 years old, a senior at a mid-tier state university my parents chose because it was good enough for someone they assumed would eventually just find a nice husband. I had a 3.95 GPA and spent my nights researching machine learning algorithms under a professor who actually knew my name. But at Sunday dinners, when I tried to mention my research, my mother would give me that patient, distracted smile, The one you give a child telling you about an imaginary friend. That's nice, honey, she'd say, her eyes already drifting. Dylan, tell your father about the promotion. Let me tell you something about quiet people. We are not quiet because we have nothing to say. We are quiet because we are observing. We are cataloging the micro-expressions, the subtle shifts in tone, the recursive layers of family dynamics. While they saw a shadow, I was seeing the data. And I was seeing the theft. My real life didn't happen in the sunshine of my parents' approval. It happened between midnight and 4 a.m. in Whitaker Hall, the university's computer science building. The third floor was a windowless labyrinth that smelled eternally of stale coffee, burnt ozone, and overheated processors. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a specific, irritating frequency, a 60 Hz hum that felt like it was vibrating against my very teeth. One of them, right above Terminal 47, flickered in a stuttering rhythm that I'd memorized like a heartbeat. I'd sit there, headphones on, and disappear into the architecture of an algorithm. For me, code is the only language that doesn't lie. It has no ego. 2 plus 2 is always 4. You cannot charm a compiler into believing it's 5. That semester, I was building my masterpiece, an adaptive optimization algorithm for large-scale data processing. It could learn from its own errors, recalibrating in real time. I'd been developing it for nearly 2 years, version after version, each one sharper, more elegant than the last. It was a work of art, a digital sculpture carved out of logic. Every iteration lived in my private repository, meticulously time-stamped and annotated. It was mine. My advisor, Dr. Ella Marsh, was a woman who was allergic to small talk. At 58, with silver hair and a gaze that could deconstruct a logic error in seconds, she was the only person who truly saw me. The first time she reviewed my code, she pulled her reading glasses down, the silver chain clinking against her neck, and looked at me over the frames. "This is graduate-level work, Adams," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Why are you here?" "My parents said this school was good enough," I replied, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, she reached into her desk and handed me a brochure. It was thick, heavy paper with an embossed crest, a prestigious university in Washington, D.C. "Apply," she said. "You deserve a place that sees you." I tucked the brochure into my bag, the edge of the paper sharp against my palm. I didn't tell anyone at home. My laptop was old and temperamental, its fan whirring like a jet engine, so I kept my backups on the family cloud account. It was a shared drive my father had set up years ago for tax documents and vacation photos. I didn't know it then, but that backup, that digital breadcrumb, was about to cost me my family and then give me my life. Dylan had a talent, though it wasn't for coding. It was for arriving. He had a way of entering a room that made it feel as though the party couldn't have possibly started without him. Sunday dinners were sacred rituals. Diane would set the table with her grandmother's china, the cream-colored plates with the gold edges that were hand-washed and patted dry. She'd light the same vanilla candle, its scent cloying and sweet, and roast the same rosemary potatoes. Dylan was always 40 minutes late, a strategic delay to ensure his entrance was the focal point. I was always 5 minutes early, helping my mother chop onions while she patted my shoulder absently, the way you'd pet a dog for not chewing the furniture. That particular Sunday, Dylan dropped into his chair, smelling of expensive woodsy cologne, the kind you buy when someone else is paying your rent, which my parents had been doing until very recently. Over the pot roast, he launched into a story about a breakthrough project at Meridian. He talked about predictive analytics and optimizing data pipelines. He used the terminology confidently, but as I listened, I felt a cold chill settle in the marrow of my bones. I recognized the phrasing. I recognized the logic gates. I recognized every recursive layer because I had written them. Richard leaned back, his chest puffed out like a prize rooster. That's my boy, leading the charge. Diane beamed, the candlelight catching the pride in her eyes, a pride I had never once seen directed at me. I set my fork down, the silver heavy and cold. I'm actually presenting a paper at the undergraduate research symposium next month, I said, my voice barely a whisper. It's on adaptive optimization. Diane glanced at me for a split second, a flicker of polite boredom crossing her face. That's wonderful, honey. Then, without a beat, she turned back to her son. Dylan, tell your father about the promotion. Did they give you the corner office? Dylan caught my eye across the table and winked. It wasn't a brotherly wink. It was the wink of a predator who knows he's been caught, but also knows you have no weapon to strike him with. That was the night I started counting the cost. The first time Dylan stole from me, he called it borrowing. I was 16 and he was 21, drowning in a master's program he wasn't smart enough for. He'd called me in a panic, asking me to walk him through a sorting algorithm I'd built. I didn't walk him through it. I wrote it for him while he dictated what his professor wanted. He got an A+. When I saw that grade posted on the fridge during Thanksgiving, right next to the turkey magnet, something small and sharp turned in my chest. I thought you said you rewrote most of it, I'd whispered to him in the kitchen. He just grinned, the light from the open fridge making him look like a stranger. I cleaned it up, Angie. Family helps family. That became the pattern. A quick question about a framework here, a sketch of a data structure there. The night he got his acceptance letter from Meridian, my father popped a bottle of cheap champagne. The cork hit the ceiling with a violent pop and left a dark mark on the white plaster that is probably still there to this day. Nobody in that kitchen knew that the capstone project that secured his degree and his six-figure job ran on code I'd written when I was 17. I used to think being invisible was the worst thing. Then I learned there's something worse, being visible only when they need something to take. The revelation came on a Tuesday in February, a day that should have been mundane, filled with nothing but syntax errors and cold coffee. I was in the lab at 11 p.m., the flicker of the overhead light matching the throb in my temples, when my inbox pinged. The sender was Marcus Webb. Hi Angela, I came across your working paper on adaptive optimization algorithms. Remarkable work. I noticed some striking similarities to the core engine at Meridian Technologies developed by your brother, Dylan Adams. Did you collaborate? I'd love to know more about the shared methodology. My hands went still. I felt the air leave the room. I opened Meridian's public tech blog and typed Dylan's name. For posts loaded. I clicked the first one. The architecture diagram was mine. The optimization logic was mine. He'd renamed the variables, the way a plagiarist changes the font on a stolen essay, but the structure, the elegant recursion I'd spent 14 months perfecting, was undeniably, legally mine. I opened the family cloud drive and clicked Access History. 47 entries. 47 times over the last 3 years, Dylan had opened my private research files. The timestamps were a map of Betrayal, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., weekends when I was away at conferences, or holidays when I was asleep just down the hall from him in my childhood bed. I sat in that lab for a long time. The fluorescent light buzzed. My coffee went stone cold, a thin film forming on the surface. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there doing the math. 6 years of theft multiplied by everything he'd built on top of it. 47 times he'd reached into my mind and taken what he wanted while I passed him the salt at dinner. The next day, I went to Dr. Marsh's office. I had a printout of the cloud access history and a face like a closed fist. She read the pages in silence, the only sound the ticking of a small brass clock on her shelf. Then she set them down and folded her hands, her silver rings catching the light. "What do you want, Angela?" she asked, her voice steady. "Revenge or your future? Can I have both?" I asked. She almost smiled, a rare, sharp expression. "Tell me your plan." Here was the cold, hard logic. If I confronted Dylan now, my parents would circle the wagons. They would protect their star. They'd cut my tuition, my only financial lifeline, and I'd be the one left in the cold. I'd lose my apartment, my lab access, and my degree. I'd blow up my life to make a point, and Dylan would still have his job and his story. In the Addams family, his word always outranked mine, but if I waited, if I secured my transfer to DC first and built my case with the precision of a debugger, I could leave on my terms. "The transfer deadline is March 1st, I said. "I know," Dr. Marsh replied. "I've already drafted your recommendation letter. I was waiting for you to ask." For the next 3 months, I played the part of the daughter they wanted. I was a ghost in my own life. I attended every Sunday dinner. I smelled the cloying vanilla candles and ate the rosemary potatoes until they tasted like cardboard. I nodded when Dylan talked about his performance bonuses and showed off the ring he'd bought for Brooke, a diamond that sparkled with the light of my stolen labor. I even complimented the seasoning on the roast while I felt the weight of the silver USB drive in my pocket, a cold, hard secret against my thigh. In late May, Dylan called me at 11:45 p.m. "Angie, quick question. The recursive optimization layer, does it collapse if you push the data set past 10 million entries? I'm seeing some lag." He was asking me to explain the code he'd claimed to write for his bosses. "It self-corrects," I said, my voice flat, professional. "There's a dampening function in the third loop. It redistributes the load to the secondary nodes. You have to trigger it manually if the cache overflows." Right. I knew that. Just confirming. I hung up and added the call to my timeline. May 24th, Dylan requested help understanding recursive optimization layer. Duration, 22 minutes. Could not explain dampening function. On June 1st, the email arrived from Washington, D.C. "Congratulations on your acceptance." I had my ticket. I had my exit. All I needed now was the final reckoning. The final mistake Dylan made was on a Wednesday in mid-June. He was at the house, drinking my father's good bourbon, the vintage from the high shelf, from a coffee mug. He looked relaxed, untouchable, the king of a hill he hadn't climbed. "The board presentation is in 3 weeks, he told me, leaning against the kitchen counter. "If they greenlight the scaling, I'm looking at VP of Engineering within 2 years. At 28, Angie." Dad actually cried when I told him. Can you imagine? "That's amazing, Dylan," I said, taking a slow sip of water. "Your algorithm must be something special." "Oh, it is," he laughed, tossing his car keys in the air. The jingle of the keys sounded like a taunt. The recursive layer alone took me, 8 months to crack? It was a grind. It had taken me 14 months. I noted that, too. 8 months was his lie. 14 was my truth. Thursday night, my apartment was a ghost of itself. The walls were bare, the echoes loud. 11 boxes were stacked against the wall like brown paper soldiers. I sat on the floor, the hardwood cold beneath me, and finalized the email I'd been drafting for weeks. 2 recipients, Meridian's Office of Corporate Compliance, and the Committee on Academic Integrity at Dillon's University. Attached was the 46-page timeline, the side-by-side code analysis, the cloud logs, and Dr. Marsh's letter. I didn't hit send. Not yet. I wanted to give them one last chance to see me. One last chance to be a family. Friday dinner smelled like roast and reckoning. The table was set for 5. My mother met me at the door with a hug that lasted a beat too long, her magnolia perfume thick and suffocating. "I'm glad you came, sweetheart." Richard sat at the head of the table, his jaw set like granite. This wasn't a dinner, it was a sentencing. "Angela," my father began, his voice heavy with the authority he used to run his production floors. "Your brother has expressed concern. He says you've been distant, cold, unsupportive of his accomplishments." I looked at Dillon. He looked down for 2 seconds, then looked up with a wounded, earnest expression. "I just want my sister back," he said, his voice actually cracking. It was a masterful performance. "I miss her." "He's been so upset," my mother whispered, reaching for his hand across the grandmother's china. "You sit there with that attitude," Richard continued, his voice rising. "We're not asking for much. Just apologize. Clear the air so we can move forward as a family." "Apologize for what exactly?" I asked. "For your behavior. For the jealousy," Richard said. "And until you do, your mother and I have decided to pause our contribution to your education. For your own good. You need to learn humility." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. They wanted one word, an apology for the crime of being stolen from. "Fine," I said. My father's shoulders dropped. A satisfied, smug smile broke across his face. "Fine," I repeated. "You can keep the tuition. I don't need it anymore." The smile froze. It was as if I'd just spoken in a language he didn't understand. "I've been accepted to transfer to a university in Washington, D.C., I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor I felt in my hands. "Full academic merit scholarship. I confirmed my enrollment 2 days ago. I'm leaving tomorrow morning. My room is already packed. 11 boxes. "Angela, you can't," Diane started, her voice shrill. "Let's talk about the algorithm, Dillon," I said, cutting her off. "The one you're using to become VP. The one you've been stealing from my cloud backups for 6 years. Dillon's face went from tan to paper white in 3 seconds. "Angela, wait, let's talk privately. I sent the documentation this morning," I said, folding my hands on the table. "To Meridian. To your graduate school. The timestamps, the access logs, the original files. It's all there. Every single one of the 47 entries you made into my mind." I opened my laptop right there between the pot roast and the wine. I turned the screen toward them. My code was in green on the left. Dillon's was in red on the right. It was a sea of crimson theft. "Explain the recursive layer, Dillon," I challenged. "Right now. Walk us through the dampening function. Tell Dad how it handles a cache overflow." He said nothing. His mouth opened, but the lies had finally run out of breath. Brooke was the first to move. She didn't scream. She didn't make a scene. She just picked up her purse, looked at Dillon with a look of profound disgust, said, "Excuse me," and walked out the front door. The latch clicked shut with a soft, final sound that felt like a gavel. Diane buried her face in her hands. The sound she made wasn't crying. It was the sound of a story collapsing. Richard just stared at the screen, looking at the proof that his star was made of borrowed light. I closed my laptop, put on my jacket, and walked out. I didn't take my science fair photo. I didn't need it. I was finally moving into the light. At 5:30 a.m. on Saturday, I loaded the 11 boxes into a white rental van. The morning air was cool, and the dew sat on the grass like scattered glass beads. The neighborhood was silent, unaware that a life had just been unmade and remade in the dark. I dropped my apartment key through the mail slot and drove east, straight into the sunrise. By July, I was in D.C. The air was a steam bath, thick and heavy, but I could breathe in a way I hadn't known I'd stopped. The email from Meridian's Office of Corporate Compliance arrived 2 weeks later. Dylan had been suspended, his badge deactivated on a Tuesday. Then came the phone calls. My mother's voice was raw, stripped of its lemon soap sweetness. Dylan might face a civil lawsuit, Angela. Your father co-signed his mortgage. If he loses his job, we're liable for $350,000. Please, for the family, withdraw the complaint. Mom, I said, looking out at the oak trees in the courtyard, their leaves steady in the humid air. I love you, but I won't set myself on fire to keep Dylan warm. Not anymore. In September, the final blow landed. I received a copy of the letter from the university. His Master of Science degree had been formally revoked. 3 words that unwrote 6 years of fiction. Meridian fired him that same week and began proceedings to recover $180,000 in performance bonuses. My father called me in October. He didn't use his gavel voice. He just sounded like a tired man who had realized he'd built his house on sand. I'm sorry, Angela, he said. I didn't know the extent of it. You didn't know because you didn't want to look, Dad, I replied. But thank you for saying it. A year has passed. The scoreboard has updated. Dylan is living in my parents' spare bedroom, the one with the old wallpaper, applying for entry-level jobs that don't require a degree he no longer has. My father is making monthly payments of $2,800 on a mortgage for a house Dylan couldn't afford. My mother is in therapy, learning how to stop choosing the easy lie. And me? I opened a peer-reviewed journal last month. There, on the first page, in crisp, black ink, was my name. Adams, A. My algorithm has evolved. It's helping people now in ways Dylan would never understand. I have a desk by a window, a new life, and a future that is entirely, undeniably mine. People ask me if I miss my family. The truth is, I miss the family I wished I had. But leaving them was the most loving thing I ever did for myself. I didn't destroy my brother. I just stopped building the floor he was standing on. Thank you for sitting with me. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever had to choose yourself over a lie, leave a comment. I read every single one. We're building a different kind of architecture here, one built on truth. Come back soon, I'll have the coffee ready and another story waiting for you. You belong here.